Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on Condo Solutions. Every Wednesday from 9 to 10 o'clock, we talk about things that you might be interested in your community. Last Wednesday of the month, we do our community solutions, talking about the nonprofit community. But the rest of the time, we kind of talk about some of the financial issues that may be happening internationally or locally that impact you in your day-to-day lives or may have an impact on you. Everything from balance of trade to sewer infrastructure. So whatever you're interested in, we're talking about it. Hopefully keeping some issues on the horizon and, just letting you know what some of the topics or issues are that are going on. We try not to make it too political, although financial issues do have political consequences, and political consequences do have financial results. And there's always there's sometimes a disconnect between the political and the financial, because you can't get elected politically if you support what's being done financially sometimes, or what's being proposed. So there are issues that do have an impact. We're going to talk about some of that. If you want to chime in, 220-9788, 220-WSTU. As one of my listeners, and I think I've only got 5, so I lost 20%. But as one of my listeners one time said, when they were critical of one of my opinions, which is fine, that they were going to stop listening, and that it was only me and my mom. And unfortunately, my mom passed away a number of years ago, so she's not listening. So I guess I'm down to maybe 1, maybe 2. But for those 2 or 3 of you that do listen and want to chime in, feel free. Welcome your call, 220-9788, 220-WSTU. This morning, I thought I would talk about a couple things that were going on and some of the things that are happening that maybe you may or may not be aware of. Just to kind of, and they're financial issues, but they're driven by some political situations. But I also want to talk, I do want to thank Taryn Christoph this morning. Taryn, by the way, for those of you that have not had the opportunity to be in Martin County for very long, we have a tremendous county administrator, and that wasn't always the case in terms of we used to change them all the time, and it was Taryn does a tremendous job. She has of course a lot of situations where many of us have jobs where we have one boss and we have to deal with that boss. Taryn has 5, and they change potentially every 2 years. So I tell you, that's almost like being an entrepreneur, where all of your customers are your bosses. But tough job when you have a situation where you have 5 politicians as a boss, and they change every couple years potentially, and the philosophy may change, and that changes your staffing. And so it's an interesting thing. She does a tremendous job. She's done a tremendous job over the years, continues to do a tremendous job. Plus, she participates in the community. She's involved in United Way. She's involved in a lot of different things that she participates in. And so I did want to, she was speaking at Martin County Business Exchange this morning, and had an opportunity to hear her again. And she's great in terms of kind of indicating what's going on and what they're trying to do, and what their goals and objectives are as staff. And so it was really a pretty interesting discussion. So
yeah, Taryn's the only county administrator I've ever had to deal with, and she's always been phenomenal.
Well, and it's hard to do that. That job is very difficult in Martin County. Many of us that have been around a long time remember that every time the commission changed, every time we went from one group, for years and years we've been 3-2, and we're either 3-2 no growth, or 3-2 pro economic growth. It's been one of the two. And every now and then there's an election and it switches. And in the old days, every 2 years they would flip back and forth, it seemed like. And when that happened, boom, the county administrator was gone, because they didn't fit that. They didn't do what the new commission thought that they should do as quickly as they should do it. And so it was a very difficult job. And I tell you what, when Taryn had been the assistant administrator, and when she got promoted into that position, I was like, man, why in the heck would you? I remember that. I said, why in the heck would you take that job? That is a bad job. I think she was interim for a period of time, but I'm thinking that is job suicide. But she's managed to make it work, and that's because she's very professional and she does the job that she's asked to do, and she does So for those of you out there, please don't kill the messenger, because she's the messenger most of the time.
Yes,
and it's one of the better. Well, she's one of the better administrators we've had. So I do want to thank her for coming into MCBE and talking a little bit this morning and sharing some of her insights. And it was a great program, and I appreciate it.
You scooped her from our show this morning.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. I didn't know, but she was on this morning and talking a little bit. And there's a lot of stuff going on in the county right now. There's a lot of activity. They are having to they're having to change some things staffing wise. We've had some changes in staff, and there's been, of course, some issues, and then there was litigation, and there was some costs involved in that, and the county does struggle a little bit for money. Our tax rate really comparably to other from a comparable basis to other places. We have one of the best school systems, and have had for years one of the best school systems in Florida. People like that. They want that. That is very, very important to people that live in Martin County, and it has to be maintained. And she's not the school board, but there are costs that are impacted. Property tax levels. Some of that money goes to the school board, doesn't go to the county. It's very difficult to increase taxes in Martin County sometimes because we have so many snowbirds that may technically live down here 6 months of the year, but they don't want to, and so that it's a residence and they vote down here, but they don't want to, they don't want their taxes to go up because they're only down here 6 months of the year. And they're not necessarily interested in providing for a lot of infrastructure for the period of time that they're not here. So some of the things that might be exciting to some people, like putting in infrastructure for utilities and underground and things like that we deal with during the hurricane season and all of that. Somebody who's not going to be here during the hurricane season sometimes doesn't care that much about that type of thing, and definitely doesn't want to spend money for it. Or road infrastructure, sewer systems, septics, things like that. There's a lot of those kind of things that sometimes don't impact people directly, or they move and they don't have to deal with it. So one of the things that I didn't realize is that Taryn mentioned this morning is that, and I don't remember the numbers exactly. I think it's about $4 million that's still owed from FEMA for Matthew.
Matthew?
For Matthew.
That's 2 storms ago.
Right. And then I think there was about, I think there's another $6 million, she said, maybe, from Irma.
Okay.
Maybe more. And there's a question as to whether that money is ever going to come in, because we had the big Texas storm at the same time, between those two. So that Matthew money may never see the light of day.
Did she say what the money was for?
It was for improvements and disaster cleanup that the county is supposed to be reimbursed for from FEMA.
Okay.
Because of the disaster being declared a disaster area, the county has to shell out that money ahead of time. Because they have to make the improvements, and that's what happens. The counties then make the improvements with the understanding that they're being refunded. That it's being refunded from the FEMA, but they have to wait until FEMA has the funding to do that, and so we make a lot of promises at the federal level. We're not always we then make the county implement it, but we don't give them the money. So that's, for those of you that don't know the difference between income and cash. There's a good example. Technically, FEMA has promised to pay the county a certain amount of money. So that is revenue, but it's not cash.
Yeah.
So they have revenue to cover their expenses. So they have a balanced budget. But unless you have the cash that goes with that, you don't have the cash. And actually that did impact here. Many of you know that we had this lawsuit with some commissioners. There was a $12 million judgment, plus I think $3 million worth of legal fees that had to be paid. And in that process, primarily because of this FEMA problem, we didn't have the cash to do that. We had to borrow money from a bank over 10 years to pay that. So we're paying for that twice, basically. We're paying for the fees and we're paying the interest cost on carrying it because the government hasn't given us the money to pay it back, and because we had to do it in the first place. But the bottom line is that that's why we had to borrow money to do that. People sometimes thought, well, maybe we borrowed it because we were just making a point, and the counties made. They weren't. They just didn't have that kind of excess cash. Nobody really wanted to borrow it, but the good thing is the county does have good borrowing capacity, but it's a shame to use that borrowing capacity on non-infrastructure. It's one thing, I personally believe, it's one thing financially to borrow money to put it into something like roads or sewers or bridges or something that's going to have a 30, 40, 50, 60-year life. It's okay, I think, to put it into that kind of thing, but to borrow money to pay for an expense that you've already incurred and that provides no long-term benefit, that's a tough way to spend tax dollars. That's going out and partying and then paying for it with a credit card. Doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's one thing if you're going to put some home improvements on your credit card, for example, and pay that out over time because you're going to get a benefit from it and lower utilities or whatever the deal is. It's another thing when when you went out and you got on a drunken binge and you spent $12 million and then you decide to borrow to pay that back. But county really didn't have any choice. They couldn't take that money out of reserves. They didn't have that kind of money available because of the FEMA issue. So that's how some of this stuff happens financially. Some people wonder what the alternative is, and it's actually the only real criticism I have with Martin County's comp plan is Martin County actually has a very, very good comp plan. Regardless of which side you're on, the fact that we control our own destiny in our own county and we can determine, it's funny, somebody asked a question this morning about 4-story height restriction, whether that would always remain, and it was a person that it's not local, and they had asked the question, and in the Martin County Business Exchange, we have a number of business people, we have a number of people that are involved in the construction trades. Unequivocally, all of those people said there's no way ever we would want to eliminate the 4-story height restriction. Now that's kind of interesting because a lot of people think that, it's these people that just want to build, and then it's not. I mean, most of us that have lived here for a long time, we like what we have, and we understand that the reason we have it is we have a comp plan that has provided us with protection over the period of time. It's allowed us to develop the county the way we wanted to develop it, not the way that the state wants it developed, not the way that somebody else wants it developed. That's frankly why I'm in favor of incorporations of towns, because it gives them even more control over how their individual community wants it. But it's one of those kind of things where it does allow you to control, and our comp plan is very, very good from that standpoint. The one fallacy I think in our comp plan is that it is not directly tied to any kind of financial funding plan. It is tied to finances. In other words, there is some, when you propose something, there's some discussion of what's that going to cost. But what is not discussed a lot of times is how is that going to be paid for? And that makes a big difference. And in my opinion, our comp plan should be adjusted so that anytime there's an amendment to the comp plan, that there also should be an amendment to the financial funding plan to show how that change will be funded. Is it going to be funded with bonds? Is it going to be funded with sales tax revenue? Is it going to be funded with property tax revenue? All of that impacts everybody differently. If it's going to be funded with sales tax revenue, people from outside our county will help pay for that, including seasonal visitors or people who are coming down to visit those seasonal visitors. People are just tourists coming down, don't even own property. If it's property taxes, only Martin County property owners will pay for it. So that would have a direct impact on Martin County taxpayers and people who live here and own property. And even if you don't own property, if you rent, your rent's got taxes built into it, trust me. So if you live here on a permanent basis, property taxes are going to impact you directly. Now, the third is bonding. Well, typically bonding has to be paid back with a revenue stream, and a lot of times that revenue stream may be, it could be sales tax dollars or it could be property tax dollars. One of the things about it, though, is if I'm a seasonal resident, and let's say I'm up in my 80s, if that's a 40-year bond issuance, I'm not going to have to pay the full 40 years. Most likely, I'm not going to be here till 120. And so from a practical standpoint, it allows you to spread that out. So not only does that, it may be borne strictly by property owners, or it may be paid through sales taxes, so non-residents may be paying a portion of it, but furthermore, future residents may be paying a portion of it because they're getting a benefit from it. It's the reason that, that people like to pay any kind of capital improvement over time. So, it's interesting how that whole process works in the county. And that's my only problem with the comp plan, is that the comp plan needs to add a component that says that we're going to also tell how that's going to be funded, with what money, not how much it's going to cost, but how much it's going to cost and where we're going to get the money to pay for it. And it's interesting because some of that may be property growth, and at that point, maybe from property taxes. Property taxes may require either an increase in the cost for your property, or it may assume new property coming online. Well, if it's a restrictive thing that limits the amount of property that could come online, then that means the property tax dollars are going to come from the existing properties. If it restricts business, it means that the property tax dollars are going to come from residents, not businesses. So businesses aren't going to pay a portion of it. So all of that stuff should be outlined, because it's really easy when somebody says, let's convert all of our septic systems to sewer. Well, you say, okay, but who's going to pay for that? And how are we going to pay for it? It's a good idea. So I would want to say, so somebody could propose in the comp plan, there needs to be sewers everywhere. We're still not going to allow growth, but there needs to be sewers everywhere because we don't want any septic systems because it's wrecking our river. So, that's fine, but then how are you going to pay for it? Particularly if you're going to require that outside the urban services district. If you're going to expand out there and start covering some of that, then who's going to pay for that? Because there is a lot less valuable property out there to pay those property taxes. So what that means is that people in the urban services district, if it's property tax based, they're going to pay it. Now, if it's bonded, it's one of those things where it's bonded, then maybe whoever lives out there ultimately, as that property develops, they'll pay for it, and they'll pay for it over a period of time. So even if it's raw land, it's not that much cost over the next 30 years, whereas to assess somebody $15,000 on a piece of land that's worth maybe $3 may not make sense. You know what I mean? So that's the kind of thing that is kind of complicated, but and it's interesting. We've got a little bit of a issue within the city of Stewart recently, which had to do with that kind of same issue, because how much a lot of bond issues, particularly as it relates to utilities, are based on certain amounts of users coming online. So when there's users added to a system, that potential addition to the system can be factored in to bond revenue for purposes of supporting a bond issuance. So let's say the county is going to issue bonds for some purpose. And when they issue those bonds, they have to provide a revenue stream. They have to provide a source of funding for those bonds. And it can be a number of different things. But in the utilities area, typically it is impact fees for hooking up to the sewer system, and then, of course, revenue from utility maintenance and utility fees that come in. But a lot of that revenue goes to maintenance. So the bonds have to be serviced, and there has to be a source of income for the service. And typically, it has to be a new source of revenue. In other words, if this is the issue that the hospital got into, the hospital on its expansion can't really bond out that expansion to do that right away. They're going to have to fund that out of pocket. You say, well, why can't they go get it? They have a hospital bond now. Well, it's one thing when you're borrowing money to add a hospital like tradition, and that's going to generate a specific amount of rooms and bed rates and revenue. So the bond buyers know that they have a source of new revenue that's going to come in to pay these bonds, which are new bonds, right? But in Stewart, for the hospital in Stewart, that was not going to increase patient revenue. It was actually going to decrease rooms slightly, not increase rooms. So what was going to happen is it was not going to produce any extra revenue. Well, if I'm buying a bond, now all of a sudden there's no revenue source. There's no revenue source. So all I'm really doing is I'm giving the hospital money to fund existing. I mean, it's basically working capital money because I don't have anything that I'm getting that is going to generate future revenue for me. I've got to count on the existing revenue, and that may be a problem. So, especially in the healthcare industry where that revenue is shrinking. So it's the same thing for the county. So when the county does a bond issuance, for example, or utility issuance, and they go out and borrow some money to do this, they're going to project out how many hookups are going to come out of this. And if they've used that as part of their bond calculation, it's almost like collateral for the bond. It's something that says to the bond owners, here's where your revenue is going to come from. Well, they can't let that go away. I mean, they can't let that go to the city of Stewart, for example. So that's a problem for them, and it's a problem. But the city of Stewart may need that to be able to increase their expansion because now they're going to have to service it. They may be the one that it's closest for them to hook up. It's most effective for them to hook up because they might be right next to their service district where the county might not be that close where they have sewer coming in there. So it's those kind of issues that are funding issues. They're issues that have to be decided, and there's a lot of nuances that take place in public finance that a lot of people don't deal with and aren't aware of, and may not fully understand why somebody does something and what happens. I'll give you one on the school board and the school situation, which is kind of interesting, and it's a big problem for us financially. Is this whole thing with the changes that were made relative to school security, and it's kind of interesting because I think a lot of people didn't fully understand what was happening prior to the shooting down south. I think a lot of people thought we had resource officers in every single school, and we did not. We had them in middle schools and high schools, but we did not have them in the 11 elementary schools. Well, the state bill that was passed required that there be a resource officer in every school, elementary included. And so as a result, the sheriff's office had to fund 11, they had to put somebody in 11 schools immediately that previously were not being manned. Now, there was a cost to that. The state said, yes, there's a cost to this. We'll give you $1 million. Well, the fact of the matter is that cost is $4 million. Now, the state gave you an alternative. They said it can be a resource officer. It can be somebody who's not a teacher, somebody in the school who's not a teacher, who you want to allow to carry a gun, a coach, some sort of guidance counselor, or, somebody like that doesn't have regular class hours. So it could be somebody like that doesn't have regular class, that's not a teacher, or it could be a volunteer. We could get a retired ranger to come into the school system, and now those are the choices. And I guess the state figured, you're going to basically choose arming your teachers and bringing in the commandos. And that's how you're going to save the $3 million that it's going to cost to do this. Because, like I said, it's $4 million to put these officers in there. Only $1 million of it is the state giving, is the state going to reimburse us for. By the way, where does the state get that money? It came right from us, right? So they just gave us our own money back. State doesn't produce revenue. That money comes and that money goes. So, most likely that $1 million is going to come from, no, most likely that $1 million is going to come from our property tax dollars. And what's interesting about that is that the way that the system works, property tax dollar wise, is rich counties pay in and then less fortunate counties get paid out. Well, we're a rich county property tax wise. So most likely we're going to be paying a large portion of that $1 million plus. So realistically, this state mandate, although technically funded at $1 million, was probably funded to Martin County at a negative $1.5 million. And that is not really good. And because more of our money is probably going to go to those other places and less back to us. Here's another interesting thing. On the ballot in November is a proposal to add another $25,000 to the property tax exemption. All right, you say, well, that schools are not included in that, so you say this won't affect the schools. Well, actually, this isn't school funding. This is the sheriff's office, which comes out of the county budget, not out of the school budget. Now, you could make the school potentially pay a portion of that.
The school does pay a portion of it.
They do pay a portion of it, but they're not required to pay a portion of this. In other words, that's a negotiated thing beyond a certain level. They're not required to pay this additional $4 million because technically the state's paying the $1 million. But it comes out of our county budget. If we don't allow the sheriff, if we don't give the sheriff the funding they need, they have the right to go to the governor and get the governor to make them give us the funding we need. The sheriff's budget's unusual is in that the sheriff's budget is presented to the county, but it is paid for, but it is, and it's technically under the county, but the sheriff really, I don't fully understand why it even goes to the county, because if the sheriff doesn't like the answer they get, they just go to the governor and say, we're not being adequately funded by the county. Make the county fund us, and then the government has the right. The governor has the right to do that. So it's kind of a mixed up situation. But anyway, so like I said, who's going to pay for this this extra $3 million? Well, it's going to have to come from taxpayers someplace, and that means mostly us. That property tax, $25,000 additional exemption. That's not going to cost there's some areas of the state that's not going to cost them anything because their property values are not are not high enough right now to exempt them out complete, or to have any additional amount that needs to be exempted. In Martin County, it will cost a lot of money. I think that Taryn said it was either $4 or $6 million is what that'll cost us in Martin County in lost tax revenue. So that'll have to be made up somehow. Tax rate increase, whatever. In Martin County, it'll have to be made up because there's no money. Otherwise, you have to cut the budget another $6 million. And we're already down $10 million from the cuts that were made as a result of the economic downturn. So, all of this stuff has to be paid for. That's my point. It's great to talk about all this stuff, but it has to be paid for. I will tell you an unintended consequence, and this is why. This is going to be a political statement. I'm one that advocates for more local control than state control, than federal control. I like city control rather than county control, and I like as much as possible is left to the people individually to decide. And the closer governance, in my opinion, the closest governance is to the people in terms of their ability to access the actual people making decisions, the more likelihood that they're going to get the decision that community wants. That may not be the decision I want. but it's going to be the decision that that community wants. So, I live in Stewart. Some decisions made in Hobe Sound, I may not like that decision in Hobe Sound, but the people in Hobe Sound may like that decision. So if they want to do that and pay for it, that's their prerogative. Don't ask me to pay for it, but if they want to do that and pay for it, that's their prerogative. Well, this is a good example. This thing with the state on talk about unintended consequences. The thing with the state was in terms of mandating certain coverage of schools and the way those schools had to be covered. It really hurt some places like Martin County that had already been proactive in terms of school security. For example, we already had resource officers in the high schools and resource officers in the middle schools, which were areas where areas where you would potentially have problems with students coming. It still doesn't stop an adult from coming on campus, but it was at least a situation where you had a resource officer on a campus that has more flexibility. Let's face it, at the high school level, you got kids moving between classes. There are people in and out of classrooms all the time. So there are less lockdowns. You have less people in classrooms constantly and staying there all day long. Middle school, same thing, although they have wings out there. There's the 6th grade wing, and then there's the 7th and 8th grade. So, and you have people moving within wings, but they're kind of staying within buildings generally. But they're still moving around. And so that causes greater security issues. People moving, people not in specific buildings at a specific time. Elementary schools, you're going into your class, you're pretty much staying in your class until you go out on a playground or something. And, it's kind of specific. I mean, extended day, they have more flexibility, more kids moving around because it's playtime, and it's, study time and play and all that kind of stuff that they do. But in the school day, you're confined to classrooms. So there's already some physical control of the campus because there shouldn't be a lot of people wandering around. So there was more control. So Martin County had already recognized some of that and had put the resources where they needed to be most, where the bigger risk was. But here's what happened as far as unintended consequences. When the governor mandated that, and the state mandated that every school had to have a resource officer, the county had to find people to put on that. So they couldn't take it off road patrol because there's not enough. So what they took it out of was what's called community policing. Now, what community policing is, that's our neighborhood police. Those are the people that are on the ground, walking the neighborhood, bicycles or vehicles within the neighborhood, but they're out in the community. They're out among the people. Frankly, a lot of that effort is in certain communities where there may be high gun usage, and where there's been problems with that. They're out in those communities. And what was happening in this, and many of us that were involved in the schools knew this, a lot of the problems, the reason we didn't have problems at the high school level or at the middle school level with these kind of things, whether it was fights, knives and all of this kind of stuff, was because the community police, a lot of the problems that occurred in the schools, particularly the high schools, had started at the home. It was a dispute between a boyfriend and girlfriend. It was a dispute between somebody stealing somebody's girlfriend. It was a drug-related issue. It was a gang-related issue. But it was something that occurred in the community the night before. And those community police officers would notify the resource officers, hey, you got to watch these guys. You may have a problem. There was an incident last night. Somebody said they were going to retaliate. They threatened to kill somebody or do something or, whatever. There was a threat. You need to keep an eye on them right away in the morning to make sure that doesn't escalate in the school system. And as a result of that, it stopped a lot of those problems. It was interesting that between that and, believe it or not, sports, those programs stopped a lot of outside activity coming into the campus and stuff going out. Years ago, there used to be a group of kids who were extremely good athletes, and those athletes wanted to play because they wanted to go on and play at a high level. They were being enticed into gang activity, and they stayed out of that gang activity because of the fact that they didn't want to blow their chance at a sports activity. So it was kind of interesting. So some of those things, but again, this school policing, this community policing made a big difference. And it's cost us now because it actually has reduced the effectiveness of the police system now, because they have had to take them out of where some of these things were. So we've actually created more risk at the middle school and high school level as a result of that. John, go ahead.
Yeah, I have trouble with Tallahassee. They passed a law where if there was an occupancy in schools, that St. Lucie County can send their kids to our school, and I have a problem with that. And now our schools are full, and now we got to build more schools because the Port St. Lucie people think they can get a better education for their kids in Martin County.
That's a good point, John. I'm glad you mentioned this, because here's the issue from a financial standpoint. And this is something that a lot of people don't realize. I like to talk about unintended financial consequences, and you're talking about, which is really good. We have to pay for that, right? So this what John's referring to for any of our listeners that aren't familiar with it is that at the last legislative session, the legislature decided that kids should have school choice, and that school choice for public schools is beyond county lines. So you can choose. Now, there's no requirement to transport. You've got to get the student to the school. But where we have a number of people who work in Martin County and they live in St. Lucie County, it is pretty easy for them to get their student to it's actually more convenient maybe for them to bring their student to a Martin County school than it is for them to take it to a St. Lucie County school, particularly if they're being bused up there. So for them, this transition opened up the door that our schools in Martin County, they had to legally now open up to anybody who wanted to come in. The only way that they didn't have to do that is if the schools were at capacity. And so what our school board did, in an effort to counterbalance this, knowing what you're talking about, John, what our school board did is they said, we're going to define capacity at 75%, because the school board had the ability to define capacity. My understanding is what they did is they defined capacity at 75%. So that took every single school out of the system from a capacity standpoint, except, I think, Warfield and Indiantown Middle. Those are the only two that are not at capacity. But other than that, I think every other school in the district is at capacity. So I think the school district thought, oh, okay, good. That solved the problem. And to some degree it does, because it does solve the problem. But here was the additional unintended consequence of that. As a result of that, the school board had to come up with a formula, or already had a formula that kicked in, and they already had one that kicked in, that when they were at capacity, there is a different calculation of building permit costs. There's an additional calculation of building permit costs. So what happened is people who were building projects for housing in Martin County, for example, this Azul that's going in the city of Stewart, the 49 apartment units, they were in the process of permitting that, and the existing permit fee is $5,000, I think, per unit goes to the schools for your permit. It's collected by the city or the municipality at the time that the builder goes in. So Azul had already paid their $5,000 per unit. But what happened is when the school system went to capacity, it kicked in a different formula. Well, that formula converts to about $42,000 per expected student, I think is the way it works. And based on the calculation of expected students within Azul, within this project here in downtown, it was going to double their impact fee. So here's a builder that's already in the process of building. They've already factored out what it's going to cost. They're not selling the units, so they can't just raise the price. They're going to have to raise the cost of the rentals probably, but they've already factored in what the market is, what the amenities are going to be and what they can get. And now all of a sudden that's going to double, really just for an arbitrary calculation. Nothing has really changed. So that was a big deal. And now where are those dollars going to be spent? Is the school district going to have to spend those on construction? And is it only construction of new schools? So it may be a situation where that revenue is raised, but the county can't, but the school can't use it. So it's really kind of a weird thing that when you get these people mandating things, like John said, the state mandates this stuff. It doesn't come with money a lot of times. It doesn't come with the ability to pay for it. And that's my problem. It's a good idea, but it doesn't necessarily come with any way to pay for it. And if you're going to do that, then give us the money to pay for it. It's my problem with the county comp plan. County comp plan is good, but if it doesn't come with a way that you're going to fund it, then that's just an unfunded mandate on the citizens of Martin County is really what it boils down to. And we should at least know what that's going to cost us and how we're going to pay for it, and who's going to pay for it, because it makes a big difference. What money's used to pay for it makes a big difference as to who's paying for it. Sales tax dollars, I'm getting a lot of St. Lucie County people to pay for stuff because they're coming down to use our waterways and our boat ramps and our beaches a lot of times. With property taxes, that's coming out of my pocket, so nobody else is helping me pay, unfortunately. So that's not a good thing. And it also impacts, of course, a lot of our young people and their ability to afford to live in Martin County as well. So, but that was a good question, John, because I was going to talk about that. That was a huge unintended consequence that we're dealing with right now. The school board has, I think, backed off that a little bit, but they're trying to look at that funding calculation again. But again, it is it's a problem, and some of the developers and builders are saying, well, I paid you those impact fees. Why should I have to pay them again? I've already put those in the hopper. So it's a lot of these kind of things. There's a lot of financial issues that become problems because people don't take into consideration what your reaction is going to be, or what's going to happen as a result of what you do. It's just like, for example, we talk about infrastructure. And you talk about roads, and we have not constructed roads where we've needed them. We've not repaired them, we've not expanded them, and we've not improved them where we needed them. And the reason was that we had a concurrency requirement in Martin County in the comp plan that says that if there's no infrastructure, even though you would be allowed to build in a neighborhood, it's perfectly legal to build there. It's not outside the urban services district. It's whatever. That if it doesn't have the roads and infrastructure, you can't get a permit until you either pay for that, or which is millions and millions and millions of dollars, or you wait until it's done. Well, then if you drag out that road construction, nobody can ever build. So if I don't want housing to occur in a certain area that's congested, like out Canner Highway, then all I do is just don't improve Canner Highway, because then concurrency kicks in and the person can't build. Now, I understand that. If you're not wanting growth, then you want to do that. But then you have to also understand the unintended consequence of that. The unintended consequence of that is that you're not putting the new roads in. So you're not putting the new stormwater sewer systems in. Stormwater runoff systems in. You're not putting the new sewer systems in. You're not putting underground utilities in. So we got utilities on poles that are costing us money. When the hurricane hits, we lose power. All of those things also aren't being done. That's all infrastructure that tends to go in when we do roads, or at least should go in when we do roads, because that's the most cost effective. For example, downtown Stewart. Downtown Stewart is going to do a streetscape project downtown. They're going to tear up the streets in downtown to pull out the trees, and it's going to be fantastic because there are huge drainage problems downtown Stewart, and there's some things that need to be done. So they're going to put in some storm sewer system changes in their drainage systems, and they're going to pull out some of these trees that are causing root issues and all of that. That all needs to be done. It's going to be very disruptive for a few months this summer, but it is going to have to be done. And when it's done, it'll be fantastic. But they're not putting underground utilities in. They're not running utilities down Seminole. They're not running underground utilities down Osceola or Flagler. Why not? Are we going to tear those roads up again to do that later? Or are we just saying we're not going to do it? Or, more importantly, are we going to do basically a hardscape program where we got to put these huge cement poles up that can't be blown down? And do we want the city of Stewart and all of downtown and your residential neighborhood to have these huge cement poles in them with these, tremendous, it'll keep them from getting blown down, but it's ugly and it's not efficient. If it's underground, it'd be much better. If it's new construction, it has to be underground. So that's the kind of things that aren't taking place. The big thing I have a problem with, our roads have cost us a ton of money in terms of sewer and septic and the quality of our river. In my opinion, that lack of infrastructure is caused us to have serious septic issues that are causing problems with our river. And, there's the money right now to bond that out and take care of it. We have a franchise fee to pay it. We have other sources of revenue. All of these things can be done very cost effectively if we plan them and do them when we need to do them. And to me, that's why I'm saying, for example, if the comp plan said that infrastructure improvements were going to be paid for by bonds, and the bonds were going to be paid off through sewer assessments or road assessments and impact fees, then to me, that sounds like a better answer. But instead, we just don't do the construction, and then we deal with the environmental damage that's as a result of not having sewer systems in Martin County, particularly in Old Palm City and in Sewell's Point and in other places where we don't have where we don't have sewer systems where we should. Anytime you're that close to the water or to estuaries or to runoff, there's no reason not to be required to have sewer systems there. But anyway, that's some of the things that I wanted to talk about this morning. Kind of just some of the financial issues that are taking place out there that are kind of interesting and that are happening at the federal level. I mean, at the state level and at the local level. A couple other issues. We had the incorporation of Indiantown out there. And that is getting started. I want to, they're going to be dealing with some financial stuff. I think budget-wise, that's usually the hardest thing for a new town to deal with is what their budget's going to actually be. And it may turn out that there's not as much money as they thought there was. So they may have to deal with property taxes and whether they may have to have a property tax increase or what's going to happen out there. So that's going to be interesting. And, of course, Hope Sound just was approved for incorporation. So that's going to be kind of interesting, too. So we'll try to keep a track of what's going on financially and try to help with some of those issues. Hopefully you'll be out there. And, John, I really appreciated the call. That was a good topic. I'm glad you reminded me. I did want to talk about some of the unintended consequences of that bill at the state level. I think John's like me. The state mandates from time to time really irritate you because of the results of what happened and what we have to do. But anyway, thank you for joining us here on our Treasure Coast Solutions every Wednesday from 9 to 10 o'clock. By the way, I'll be on tonight on the Martin County Business Exchange show, so we can talk about some of these issues then if you want. But I appreciate you joining us for our discussion here this morning, right here on WSTU Digital 1450. We're Martin County's Heritage Station.